Welcome to Part 4 of our 5-part series on building and detailing the 1/48 scale Revell monogram B-26 Marauder. In Part 4, we'll assemble the interior, close up the fuselage, glue on the wings and the tail, and then mask the fuselage assembly for airbrushing. Prior to adding the interior parts, I did one last check of the interior walls of the fuselage to make sure all the details were added. In checking the fuselage halves for fit, I noticed there's a slight misalignment between the left and right sides. I chose to have the bottom of the fuselage halves line up and then sand and shape the upper surface. In retrospect, I should have aligned the top half of the fuselage sides together and then sanded and shaped the bottom. I painted the edges of the clear parts with a fine detail brush with zinc chromate green so that white glue would stick to these parts better. Each clear part was set in place and a bead of white glue was applied around the perimeter of each part. The cockpit assembly is now almost complete and it's looking pretty good. Here, the cockpit assembly is getting one final fit check. The back of the instrument console can be seen through the nose glass, so wiring was added to the instrument backs to add an additional level of detail. A drop of white glue was applied to each engine lever location, and then these tiny photo etch parts were positioned one at a time. The tips will be painted black, red, and white with the tip of a round toothpick. The trim wheel was added to the side of the console, and then the cockpit assembly was glued into place. The aft guns and then the aft bulkhead were glued into place next. The fuselage halves were positioned with masking tape and beads of superglue applied along the seam lines. Note the amount of superglue applied along the top seam line. The upper positioning pins should have been removed so that the fuselage halves would get a better fit. With the masking tape peeled back, additional superglue was applied at these locations using my trusty .018-inch diameter stiff wire. Reinforcing strips were added to the inside area of the Bombay to add strength to the seam line. This will prevent it from cracking due to the amount of weight located in the fuselage. The wing insert will hide these strips. With the opening sealed to keep sanding dust out, the seam line was scraped and sanded smooth. The upper masking tape strips cover the surface detail. The misalignment in the upper fuselage seam line required a lot of filling and sanding. The two hatches on the upper fuselage were sanded off because they were badly misaligned. They'll be replaced with photo etch parts. Several applications of superglue and silver paint were needed in order to get the seam fixed along the upper surface of the fuselage. A length of .010 by .020 inch strip was superglued into place to fix the tiny void at this location. Microsanding sticks were used to remove the remaining raised panel line detail on the wings and the fuselage. The fuselage and the main wings are now ready for assembly. Small strips of plastic were superglued into place where the indentations are located on the elevator assembly. The plastic strips have been trimmed and now this part is ready to be glued into place on the fuselage. The interior paint color was carefully scraped off where the elevator assembly attaches to the fuselage. The tiny voids around the elevator assembly on the right side of the fuselage will be filled and sanded to shape. The same voids are on the port side of the fuselage, and they too will be sanded and shaped. These tiny white plastic strips were added to help close up the void between this area and the aft clear part. Tiny strips of plastic were inserted into the voids, superglued into place, and then trimmed. The port side was also completed in the same way. The underside seams on both sides of the elevator assembly were not too bad, so they were filled with superglue. The aft lower area of the fuselage sides were thin, so a strip of plastic was added to increase the strength of the seam so it wouldn't crack while working on the elevator. Careful wet sanding and shaping with sandpaper wrapped around different thicknesses of balsa wood were used to shape the elevator to fuselage connection areas. It took several iterations of checking and rechecking with silver paint and drops of superglue to finally get a smooth surface. The undersides were wet sanded smooth with sandpaper wrapped around balsa wood strips. Here again, silver paint helps find any remaining flaws. The starboard side took about as much work as the port side to get everything shaped correctly. The transition area between the side of the fuselage and the elevator isn't perfect, but it's close. Once the seams and voids were completed, the plastic was wet sanded smooth with 600 grit sandpaper and then polished with fine steel wool pads. To get a tighter fit between the main wings and the fuselage, trim the stubs on the wing supports. Some trimming on the upper wing to fuselage connection surfaces will also help get a tighter fit. The right wing was glued into place first. Several layers of superglue were applied to fill the tiny void along the upper area of the wing connection point. The underside of the right wing was also pretty tight, and superglue filled the voids. Note the slight misalignment on the leading edge. Testor's red tube glue was used to set the left wing so that there would be some time for proper positioning. Lengths of .015-inch strips were needed to fill the void on the upper leading edge, and the rest were filled with superglue. The upper wing has a step that's going to require some sanding to get it to smooth out. The underside of the left wing had its entire void filled with .015-inch strips. Superglue was applied to both sides to seal the areas around the strips and the tiny voids between them. Small sanding sticks worked well to contour the area on the upper left wing. The upper right wing seam was much easier to sand smooth. The underside seam areas needed several applications of superglue and silver paint to fill all the tiny voids. Note how the balsa strip ends are shaped so that the wet sandpaper can get into the tight area between the fuselage and the engine nacelle. The plastic just needs to be polished with fine steel wool pads. The masking tape will remain in place until after all the steel wool residue is removed. With all the masking tape removed, the upper surface is really starting to look good. The lower surface looks good too. Note how smooth the connection point is between the wing and the fuselage on the upper starboard side. It took some work to get the step on the port side wing connection point to the fuselage smoothed out, but the seam area looks good. This is a good example of using multiple iterations to smooth out a seam. This underside seam area looks very good. When sanding in these tight areas, it's easy to create a slight trench from all the sanding, so go slow, use minimal pressure, and check your work frequently. The voids inside the Bombay areas were filled with white glue. Each application was checked with paint after it dried, and more glue was added until all the voids were filled. The area around the Bombay was masked for airbrushing. The inside upper surface should have been airbrushed before the wings were attached to the fuselage. The inside areas of the Bombay were airbrushed and then the tape was removed. The Eduard detail set for this kit provides replacement photo etch parts for the two hatches on the upper forward area of the fuselage. This one had a hole in it that needed to be filled. I decided to just cover the hole with a small section of evergreen strip stock, and then I applied a tiny bead of superglue around the perimeter of the hatch to seal it properly. The round hatch outline was traced onto the fuselage surface to help position it. The clear plastic part was white glued into place into the opening on the top of the hatch. The perimeter of the round hatch also received a tiny bead of superglue. The superglue frosted the tiny clear part, so it was inked black after the fuselage was painted. Shaping these two photo-etched parts so that they sat correctly on the fuselage was difficult. Plastic sheeting cut to shape and glued into place would have been a good alternative. The tail skid was glued into place with Tester's red tube glue so that it could be properly positioned. Note the pencil marks to help center the part. Masking the landing gear base starts with adding tiny strips of masking tape around the perimeters of the curved surfaces. Tissue was stuffed inside the openings, and then the strips of masking tape were applied along the straight edges. Additional tape was then applied over the tissue to completely seal the openings. The clear parts were masked with tiny strips of masking tape. The Bombay was covered using the same technique as the landing gear base. The cockpit, the nose, the turret openings, and the tail gun openings were masked using the same method as the landing gear base. The upper surfaces of the assembly have now all been masked. A final check of the lower masking was also completed. The inside areas of the engine cowlings were masked, and then they were taped in place from the inside. The assembly is now ready to be primed. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for Part 5 of our 5-part series on building and detailing the 148 scale Revell monogram B-26 Marauder. In Part 5, we'll airbrush the surface, we'll do final assembly, we'll add the decals, and then I'll show you how I fade the decals into the painted surfaces. And if you get the chance, visit our website by just clicking the link on our YouTube page, where you'll find dozens and dozens of free PDF downloads to sharpen your model skills and provide you all kinds of tips and techniques on building better scale models. Have a great evening.